Before humans built cities, laws, or religions, they first had to stay alive. They needed food, warmth, shelter, and safety from animals, weather, and hunger. But something strange began to happen. Even when life was still hard, humans started caring about more than the next meal. They cared for the weak. They remembered the dead. They made marks, shared stories, and returned to places that meant something. None of these things filled the stomach right away. So why did the human mind begin to reach beyond survival? Long before any city wall, written law, or temple stone, human life was shaped by very simple needs that could not be ignored. A body had to be fed. A fire had to be kept alive. A child had to stay warm through the night. A wound had to close without becoming fatal. A group had to notice the change in weather before the cold arrived, and it had to move before hunger became too heavy to think through. In that older world, survival was not a single task. It was not only the search for meat, or fruit, or roots. It was not only running from animals, finding shelter, or making tools from stone and wood and bone. Survival was a web of small pressures that returned every day, often without mercy. The body needed calories, but the mind also needed direction. The hands needed skill, but the group also needed timing. A person could have food and still be unsafe. A person could have shelter and still lose the fire. A person could know where water had been last season and still fail if the season had changed. This is why the first question in this story cannot be only, when did humans stop thinking about survival? They never did. The better question is quieter and more difficult. When did survival become wide enough to include things that looked, at first, like something more? For early humans, danger did not always arrive with teeth. It could arrive as darkness, distance, fever, a storm that lasted too long, a river that rose too quickly, or a familiar path that no longer led to food. Hunger was not just an empty stomach, it changed judgment. Cold was not just discomfort, it took strength away slowly. Injury was not just pain, it could separate a person from the group, and separation itself could become a danger. Even memory had a survival value, because the world did not explain itself twice. A place that held water one year might dry out the next. A plant that fed people in one season might disappear beneath frost in another. Tracks in mud, clouds on the horizon, the sound of birds, the smell of smoke, the silence before weather changed, all of these small signs could matter. To survive was to read the world carefully, not once, but again and again. Yet this careful reading also began to open another space inside human life. When a group remembered a route, protected a sleeping child, waited for someone slower, shared warmth near the fire, or carried knowledge from one season into the next, survival was no longer just the body continuing for one more day. It was becoming something held between people. This does not mean early humans suddenly became gentle in a modern sense, or that every group behaved the same way. The evidence from deep time is fragmentary, and we should be careful not to imagine more than we can know. But we can say this with honesty. Human survival was never only private. A lone body could breathe, eat, and move, but a human life depended on others noticing, remembering, teaching, warning, and staying near. The roots of caring about more than survival may not have begun after hunger was solved. They may have begun while hunger was still present, while fear was still real, while the night was still cold, because the act of staying alive had already become shared. To understand why humans began to care about more than survival, we first have to look at how survival itself changed when it belonged to a group. A single person could gather berries, sharpen a stone, or hide from rain, but no single person could easily hold every part of life at once. Someone had to watch the fire while others slept. Someone had to remember which slope held roots after the dry season. Someone had to notice when a child wandered too close to water, or when an older person began to fall behind. Someone had to hear a branch break in the dark and understand that the sound mattered. In this way, survival was spread across many minds and many bodies. It was not carried only in muscle, but in attention. It was not carried only in tools, but in memory. A hand could make a cutting edge, but another person had to teach how to strike the stone. A mouth could eat, but a group had to decide whether food would be shared now, saved briefly, or carried to someone who had not found enough. These were not small details around survival. They were survival itself, slowly becoming social. Fire gives a simple example. Fire warmed the body, softened food, kept some animals away, and made darkness less complete. But fire also required care beyond the moment. It had to be fed before it died. It had to be protected from rain and wind. People had to know where embers could be found again, how dry wood behaved, how smoke moved inside a shelter, and when flame was useful or dangerous. Around a fire, survival became a shared rhythm. One person's sleep depended on another person's watchfulness. One child's warmth depended on someone gathering fuel before night. One injured person's chance depended on whether the group moved too fast or waited long enough. None of this should be romanticized. Early human groups were not peaceful circles outside time. They faced fear, scarcity, tension, and hard choices. But the important point is that human survival did not remain locked inside the individual body. It became something negotiated quietly through repeated acts, sharing a place near the warmth, warning before danger arrived, letting knowledge pass from one pair of hands to another. Even the act of moving through land required more than strength. A group needed memory of water, shelter, animal movement, edible plants, stones useful for tools and places to avoid. The strongest person did not automatically know all of this. A child could notice something small. An elder could remember something old. A skilled maker could keep blades sharp. A careful listener could hear weather before others saw it. Survival began to include many kinds of value. Not only speed, force, or hunger. This matters for the question at the center of this story, because caring about more than survival may not have begun as a separate, higher thought. It may have begun when people realized, slowly and without saying it in those words, that a group was not just a collection of bodies competing against danger. It was a living system of attention, memory, patience, and dependence. To protect the group was to protect the future meal, the future fire, the future root, the future child. Before humans built monuments or wrote laws, they were already learning that life could be held between people. And once life was held between people, the line between surviving and caring began to grow less clear. The more closely we look at early human survival, the less it appears to be a narrow struggle for the next mouthful of food. Food mattered, of course. Warmth mattered. Shelter mattered. The body could not ignore hunger, cold, injury, or fear. But human life did not remain at the level of the body alone. A group that wanted to live through another season had to carry more than meat and firewood. It had to carry knowledge, trust, timing, and habits that helped people remain together when the world became difficult. This is where the question begins to change shape. Caring about more than survival may not have started after survival became easy. It may have begun because survival was never easy, and because a human being could not face it alone. When a person shared food with someone who had failed to find any, that act could help the group remain whole. When someone slowed down for a child or an injured adult, the group gave up speed, but it also preserved a life, a relationship, and perhaps knowledge that might matter later. When people repeated a route because someone remembered where water had been found before, they were not only moving through land, they were trusting memory. When fire was protected through the night, it was not only heat being saved, it was the next morning's safety, the next meal's preparation, and the fragile comfort that allowed people to sleep. These things can look ordinary from a distance, but they show how survival widened inside human life. The early human world did not reward waste. Energy was costly. Time was costly. A careless choice could mean hunger, danger, or loss. For that reason, any behavior that lasted across generations probably had to belong, in some way, to the deeper pattern of living. But that does not mean every human action was simple or selfish. A gesture could begin as practical and still become meaningful. A shared fire could warm the body and also create a place where people recognized one another. A remembered path could lead to food and also become part of a group's story of where it had been. The care given to a child could protect the future of the group and also deepen the bond between bodies and minds. In this quiet way, the first steps beyond survival may have been hidden inside survival itself. They were not necessarily dramatic inventions. They may have been repeated acts that slowly changed what life felt like from within. Waiting, sharing, remembering, returning, teaching, watching over one another. We should be careful here, because the deep past does not give us complete thoughts, complete conversations, or clear records of feeling. It gives us bones, tools, hearths, marks, burials, pigments, paths of movement, and traces that must be interpreted with patience. We cannot simply place modern emotions into ancient minds and call it truth, but we can follow the pattern that the evidence allows. Humans survived as social, remembering, teaching beings, and once survival depended on memory, care, and shared attention, the boundary between staying alive and building meaning became very thin. Maybe the human mind did not one day step out of survival and into something higher. Maybe it slowly discovered that to survive as a human was already to protect more than the body. It was to protect the warmth between bodies, the knowledge between generations, and the fragile sense that a life was not only something kept alive for today, but something carried forward into tomorrow. A human body, by itself, was never the most powerful thing in the ancient landscape. It did not have the weight of a great animal, the speed of a fleeing herd, the claws of a predator, or the thick hide of creatures built to endure cold and attack. Human strength existed, but it was limited. A person could run, climb, throw, carry, cut, and remember, yet the body was still soft, easily wounded, easily chilled, and dependent on food that had to be found again and again. This physical weakness is important, because it helps explain why humans did not survive only by becoming stronger as individuals. They survived by becoming more deeply connected. A person alone could sleep, but not safely for long. A person alone could make a tool, but might not know where the right stone was found. A person alone could find food, but might lose it, spoil it, or fail to find enough tomorrow. A person alone could hear danger, but only from one direction. In a group, the human body became larger than itself. Other eyes watched while one pair of eyes closed. Other hands carried what one pair of hands could not. Other memories held places, seasons, losses, and warnings that one mind might forget. This does not make early human life gentle or simple. Groups could bring tension, conflict, hunger, and difficult choices, but they also gave the individual body a wider form. The group became, in a practical sense, part of the body's protection. When someone stood near the fire while others slept, the sleepers were not surviving only through their own strength. When food was shared with a child, the child's body was being held by the effort of adults. When an injured person was not abandoned immediately, that person's weakness was being carried for a time by the patience of others. This is where the question of caring about more than survival begins to feel less distant. If survival had been only a private contest between one body and the world, then anything beyond personal hunger might have seemed unnecessary. But human survival was not private. It was built through repeated dependence. A person had to trust that the group would not leave too quickly. A child had to trust hands that lifted, fed, and warned. A hunter or gatherer had to trust the memory of someone who had seen a valley in another season. Even fear was shared, because one person's alarm could become everyone's movement. Over time, this made the boundary between self and group less clear. To protect another person could also protect the knowledge, labour, warmth, and future of the group. To stay close to others was not just comfort, it was a way of remaining alive. But something quiet happens when survival depends so strongly on others. The other person stops being only another mouth to feed. They become a shelter of memory, attention, and possibility. The old one may remember a dry path. The child may become the future of the group. The careful maker may keep tools useful. The tired watcher may keep the night from becoming dangerous. In this way, human beings began to live inside a circle of mutual need. They did not have to invent meaning separately from survival. The conditions of survival were already teaching them that another life could matter to their own. Before there were formal rules, written promises, or moral teachings, the body itself may have learned a quiet lesson. I live more safely when your life is also protected. The daily life of an early human group was held together by acts that could seem small when seen from far away. Passing food from one hand to another, keeping children near the warmth, staying awake while others slept, carrying embers, repairing a shelter, noticing who had eaten less, who was limping, who had grown quiet from fever or exhaustion. None of these acts needed a written rule to matter. They belonged to the practical rhythm of staying alive, but inside that rhythm, something deeper was forming. A piece of food was not only calories when it was given to someone who had failed to find enough. It was a decision, even if no one named it that way. A child held close to the fire was not only a small body being warmed, it was the future of the group being protected before that future could repay anything. A night watch was not only a useful task, it meant one person's tiredness was accepted so that others could rest. In a world where hunger, weather, and danger could return at any time, these repeated acts created a kind of trust that was not separate from survival, but grew out of it. The group had to learn who could be counted on, who remembered, who warned, who shared, who stayed near when movement became difficult. This is one of the quiet places where humans may have begun to care about more than immediate survival, because the act of surviving together required people to pay attention not only to the land, but to one another. A fire had to be tended, but so did the fragile order around it. If food was never shared, children would suffer, the injured would weaken, and cooperation would become harder the next time danger came. If no one watched during the night, sleep itself became risky. If no one cared whether the slowest person fell behind, the group might move faster for one day, but lose memory, skill, kinship, or trust that could matter later. This does not mean every act was kind in the way we use the word now. Deep prehistory does not allow us to hear voices clearly enough to know motives. People may have shared because of kinship, habit, pressure, expectation, affection, need, or some mixture of all of these. The honest point is not that early humans were pure or noble. The point is that survival created conditions in which another person's condition could not be ignored. A hungry child, a tired elder, a wounded companion, a sleeping group beside low embers, these were not abstract moral ideas. They were living problems that had to be answered with hands, food, patience, and attention. Over many generations, such answers could shape the mind. To notice another person's weakness was useful, but it could also become familiar. To feed someone today could help the group tomorrow, but it could also make that person part of a shared life. To guard the sleeping was practical, but it also made rest possible for others. In this slow way, the ordinary work of survival began to teach the human mind a larger pattern. Life was not only something each body defended alone, it was something passed back and forth, protected in turns, and carried through repeated acts of dependence. The question, then, is not whether early humans suddenly abandoned survival for higher feelings. They did not have that luxury. The question is whether survival itself became so social, so shared, and so dependent on attention to others that caring began to grow from the same roots as hunger and warmth. A group that kept its fire alive was keeping bodies alive, but it was also keeping a center. A group that fed its children was protecting tomorrow. A group that waited for someone weak was choosing, for a moment, that the value of a life could not be measured only by speed. These choices may have been quiet, uneven, and practical, but they point toward the same beginning. Humans started to move beyond bare survival when survival required them to protect the lives around them, not only their own. When a life depends on other lives, the mind begins to notice people in a different way. A companion is no longer only someone walking nearby. A child is no longer only a small body that must be fed. An older person is no longer only slower footsteps at the edge of the group. Each person carries something that may not be visible at first: memory, skill, warning, comfort, future, or the fragile trust that keeps a group from breaking apart under pressure. This is not the same as saying early humans thought about one another in the language of modern morality. We do not know their private thoughts. We do not know the exact words they used, or how they explained care, grief, patience, or obligation to themselves. The deeper past gives us traces, not complete inner lives, but those traces still point toward a human reality that is difficult to ignore. To survive as a human was to live inside a network of dependence. If one person remembered a water source, others could live because of that memory. If one person knew how to make a sharp edge from stone, others could eat because of that skill. If one person heard danger before the rest, the whole group could move before it was too late. If one person cared for a child long enough, the group carried itself into a future beyond the present hunger. In this world, usefulness was not always immediate. Some forms of value took time to appear. A child could not hunt today, but might one day remember the route being walked now. An injured adult might slow movement today, but might still hold knowledge, kinship, or trust that the group was not ready to lose. An elder might no longer travel as quickly, but could carry seasons inside memory. When people began to live with this kind of delayed value, survival itself became less simple. It was no longer only about what helped the body in the next hour. It also involved what helped the group remain whole across days, seasons, and generations. This is one reason the beginning of caring about more than survival cannot be reduced to art, burial, ornament, or ritual alone. Those things matter, and later they will become important signs. But before a mark was made on stone, before a body was placed carefully in the earth, before a shell or pigment may have carried meaning, there was already the quieter practice of living as if another person's life affected one's own. That practice may have been practical before it was symbolic. It may have been repeated before it was explained. It may have been felt before it was named. A group that waited, warned, taught, shared, and remembered was not leaving survival behind. It was expanding survival into relationship. The other person became part of the way one stayed alive, and once that happened, attention to another person could deepen beyond the immediate need of the moment. The group did not need a written law to understand that abandoned children meant no future, that ignored warnings meant danger, that broken trust made cooperation harder, and that lost knowledge could cost lives later. These were not ideas floating above daily life. They were lessons pressed into the body by hunger, weather, movement, fear, and return. So perhaps one of the earliest steps beyond bare survival began when humans started to protect not only food, fire, and shelter, but the relationships that made food, fire, and shelter possible. A person could become important not only because of strength, but because of memory, not only because of speed, but because of patience. Not only because of what they could take from the world, but because of what they helped others carry through it. In that quiet change, the group became more than a tool for survival. It became a place where meaning could begin to gather, slowly, around living bodies. One of the most difficult questions in the deep human past is what happened when a person could not keep up. A broken bone, a damaged foot, a serious infection, a weak child, an exhausted mother, an aging body, or a wound that made walking painful could change everything. In a world where movement mattered, weakness was not a small inconvenience. It could slow the group, increase the need for food, require attention, and expose everyone to danger if the group stayed too long in one place. This is why the possibility of caring for the weak is so important. It does not prove that early humans thought as we think, or felt care in exactly the way modern people describe it, but it does show that, at some points in human and closely related human lives, a body that was no longer at full strength could still remain inside the circle of others. That alone is not a small thing. A severely injured person cannot survive for long on courage alone. Pain makes movement harder. Infection can steal strength. A damaged limb can make hunting, gathering, climbing, carrying, or escaping almost impossible. If such a person survived long enough for bone to heal, or long enough for long-term damage to become part of life rather than an immediate death, then we have to ask what made that survival possible. Sometimes the answer may be simple luck. Sometimes an injury may have been less disabling than it looks from the bone alone. Sometimes the environment may have allowed rest. We must be honest about those limits. Archaeology does not let us stand beside the fire and watch what people did, but repeated signs of survival after injury still open a careful door. They suggest that, in some ancient groups, weakness did not always mean instant abandonment. Someone may have shared food. Someone may have waited. Someone may have helped with movement, protection, warmth, or cleaning a wound. Someone may have allowed a person with reduced strength to remain part of the group instead of being left outside it. This connects directly to the question of when humans began to care about more than survival, because caring for a weak person seems at first to challenge the cold logic of survival. A body that cannot contribute fully appears costly. It needs food. It needs time. It may slow movement. Yet the human group was not only a machine for immediate efficiency. It held memory, kinship, learned skill, future possibility, and emotional attachment. Even if we cannot measure all of those things in bones, a person who is weak today might still be a parent, a teacher, a maker, a warning voice, a familiar presence, or someone whose life mattered to others before any practical calculation was made. This does not mean early humans were always kind. It means the human way of surviving left room at times for care that was not immediately profitable in the narrowest sense. The weak person forced the group to answer a quiet question without words. Is a life valuable only while it is strong? Deep time does not give us the answer in a simple sentence. It gives us healed injuries, altered bones, survival after damage, and the possibility that other hands were involved. And perhaps that is enough to slow our thinking. Before humans made monuments to meaning, they may already have been making space for lives that needed help. Not always, not everywhere, not perfectly, but often enough for the traces to remain, and for us to see that survival, in human hands, could stretch toward patience. It would be easy to look at the care of the weak and turn it too quickly into a modern story of kindness. That would not be honest enough. The people of deep prehistory did not leave written explanations of why they helped, waited, shared, or stayed close to someone who could not easily contribute. We do not know whether a wounded person was protected because of affection, kinship, habit, usefulness, fear of losing knowledge, group expectation, or some quieter feeling we cannot name. The safer truth is more modest, but still powerful. In some ancient human lives, weakness did not always remove a person from the human circle. That is already enough to matter. A healed injury, a survived illness, or a body that lived for years with serious limitation does not give us a complete emotional world, but it does suggest time. Time for healing. Time for food to be brought or shared. Time for movement to slow or adjust. Time for others to tolerate a body that could not always move with the strongest. In a hard landscape, time itself was expensive. A group could not spend it endlessly without cost. So when a weak person remained alive, especially through a condition that would have made independent survival difficult, we are allowed to ask what kind of social life made that possible. Care does not have to begin as a noble idea to be real. It can begin as a hand steadying another body, a portion of food given without immediate return, a place near the fire kept open, a slower pace accepted for part of a journey, or a child watched while another adult searches for food. These actions are practical, but practicality does not empty them of meaning. In human life, the practical and the emotional often grow together. Feeding a child keeps the group's future alive, but it also creates attachment. Waiting for an injured companion may preserve knowledge, but it also teaches the group that a person is not only their speed. Helping an elder remain close may protect memory, but it also gives shape to belonging. This is why caring for the weak is such an important step in the question of more than survival. It shows that survival could expand beyond immediate strength. A group that only valued the strongest body at every moment would lose children before they matured, elders before their memories could be used, and injured adults before recovery was possible. Human survival required a longer view. It had to make room for people whose value unfolded over time. A child is costly before becoming helpful. A sick person may be costly before healing. An older person may be physically slower but mentally rich with remembered seasons, roots, tools, dangers, and social ties. In this way, the weak person reveals something hidden about human survival. It was never only about the present body. It was also about continuity. The group survived by carrying lives through periods when those lives could not carry themselves. Still, we should keep the language calm. We do not need to claim that early humans had hospitals, moral systems, or conscious theories of compassion. That would be too much. What we can say is that care may have existed as a repeated behavior before it became a stated value. The body in need called forth responses from other bodies. The hungry child cried. The injured adult slowed. The fevered person could not gather. The old one remembered but could not always travel quickly. Each case asked the group to decide, again and again, whether survival belonged only to the strongest present moment, or whether it included the fragile lives that made a human group continuous through time. Somewhere inside these ordinary decisions, the human mind may have learned that another person could matter even when they were not useful right away. And once that lesson existed, even quietly, survival had already begun to stretch into care. The presence of a weak person inside an ancient group changes the question we are asking. It moves the story away from a simple picture of survival as strength alone. If survival had only belonged to the fastest, the strongest, and the most immediately useful, then many human lives would have ended before they had time to become valuable in any larger sense. Children would have been a burden for too long. Injured adults would have been too costly to keep near. Elders would have become unnecessary as soon as their bodies slowed. But human groups did not survive by strength alone. They survived by memory, learning, attachment, timing, and the ability to carry one another through periods of dependence. This does not mean every weak person was saved. It does not mean every group had the same customs. It does not mean care was always gentle, equal, or free from hardship. Deep prehistory was not a moral lesson written for us. It was a hard and uneven world, but the traces of long survival after injury or limitation remind us that some human and closely related human communities could hold a life even when that life required support. That matters because it shows a possible widening of value. A person did not have to be strong in the present moment to remain part of the group's future. They might recover, they might remember, they might teach, they might comfort a child, they might carry a relationship that held others together. Or perhaps they simply belonged, and belonging itself had become part of human survival. This is where care begins to look like more than a helpful habit. It becomes a way of keeping the group continuous through time. To feed a child is to protect someone who cannot yet repay the effort. To wait for the injured is to accept that a life may still matter while it is slowed. To keep an elder near is to make room for memory inside a world that cannot be written down. These actions may have been practical, but they also formed a quiet answer to the coldness of immediate survival. They said, without needing words, that the group was not only a collection of useful bodies, it was a web of lives at different stages, some strong now, some weak now, some learning, some remembering, some carrying, some being carried. That web made humans different from a creature living only for the next bite of food. It did not remove hunger, it did not remove danger, it did not make the ancient world safe, but it changed what had to be protected. Food still mattered, fire still mattered, shelter still mattered. Yet now the slow child, the wounded adult, the tired elder, and the sleeping group also mattered as parts of the same fragile system. The beginning of caring about more than survival may have been found there, not in a sudden discovery of kindness, but in the repeated decision to let a life remain inside the circle, even when it could not immediately give back. Over time, such decisions could teach the human mind that value is not always visible at once. A body can be weak and still hold memory. A child can be helpless and still hold the future. An injured person can slow the group and still belong to it. And when humans began to live with that truth, survival was no longer only the defense of the strong, it was the protection of the vulnerable thread by which the whole group continued. Among the many forms of weakness that shaped early human life, childhood may have been the most important, because human children are not briefly helpless. They remain dependent for a long time. A newborn cannot cling to safety in the way some young animals can. A small child cannot understand weather, hunger, fire, distance, danger, or the hidden meaning of tracks in mud. Even an older child who can walk, carry, and imitate still needs years before the body, hands, memory, and judgment are ready for the full difficulty of adult life. This long childhood made human survival costly. It meant that adults had to spend energy on beings who could not yet provide the same energy back. Food had to be shared with mouths that could not gather enough for themselves. Warmth had to be given to bodies that cooled quickly. Attention had to be divided between the land and the children moving through it. A group could not simply follow the strongest pace if the young were too small to keep up. The presence of children slowed movement, complicated decisions, and made danger more delicate. A cry could reveal a hiding place. A small mistake near water, fire, height, or an animal could become deadly. In the cold logic of immediate survival, childhood seems almost impossible, too long, too fragile, too demanding. And yet this long dependence became one of the deepest foundations of human life. Children were not only weak bodies needing protection, they were the place where the future of the group existed before it was strong enough to defend itself. To care for a child was to spend the present on something that would only matter fully later. This connects directly to the question of when humans began to care about more than survival, because childhood forced early people to live beyond the next moment. A child could not repay food that day. A child could not guard the camp that night. A child could not remember the old migration route with the accuracy of an elder. But the child could become the one who would learn the route, carry the fire, copy the tool stroke, remember the warnings, recognize edible plants, and one day hold another child close to the warmth. In this way, the care of children made time deeper. Survival was no longer only about keeping alive the bodies that were already useful. It was about protecting a life before its usefulness had arrived. We should not imagine this as a soft and easy childhood. Prehistoric children likely lived close to real work, real danger, and real loss. They learned by watching, imitating, touching, carrying, listening, and making mistakes under the eyes of others. They may have gathered small foods, tended younger children, helped prepare materials, or practiced with tools long before adulthood. But their dependence still mattered. They required food when they were hungry, comfort when frightened, teaching when confused, and protection when their curiosity outran their judgment. Every time a group made space for that long learning, it was doing something more complex than surviving one more day. It was building continuity. A tool skill does not survive unless a child sees it often enough to copy it. A safe route does not survive unless someone young learns why it is safe. A warning about a dangerous plant, a thin ice crossing, a dry season path, or an animal's behavior does not survive unless it passes into another mind. The child's body was small, but the child's future memory was enormous. This is why childhood sits close to the beginning of human meaning. It turned survival into inheritance. It made the group protect not only life as it existed, but life as it was becoming. Somewhere in the long patience required to feed, watch, guide, and teach the young, humans were already caring for something beyond the immediate hunger of the present. They were caring for tomorrow while tomorrow was still unable to stand on its own. A child did not enter the human world already knowing how to survive in it. The land had to be learned slowly, and much of what mattered could not be understood from one lesson. A child had to see which plants were touched and which were avoided, which stones broke cleanly and which shattered badly, which tracks meant food, which tracks meant danger, which clouds brought cold rain, which silence in the trees felt ordinary, and which silence made adults look up. These were not simple facts stored in a single mind. They were patterns, repeated over time, until the young began to feel the shape of the world through memory and habit. Teaching may not always have looked like formal instruction. It may often have been quieter, a gesture of the hand, a correction, an adult taking a tool away before it caused injury, a child allowed to watch close enough to understand, a small task given before a larger one, a story repeated near the fire until a place, an animal or a danger became easier to remember. In that long process, survival became inheritance. The group was not merely feeding children so their bodies would grow, it was placing the world inside them. This matters because human survival depended on knowledge that could not be remade from the beginning in every generation. If each child had to discover alone which roots were edible, which water was safe, which animals were dangerous, which paths led back to shelter, and which seasons changed the land, too many lives would be lost to lessons already learned by others. A human group survived partly because the young did not begin from nothing. They began inside a field of remembered things. Someone had already burned fingers near flame and learned caution. Someone had already followed an animal trail and learned where it led. Someone had already eaten the wrong thing, crossed at the wrong place, slept in the wrong hollow, or waited too long before moving. The child inherited not only tools but warnings. Not only food, but ways of finding food. Not only shelter, but the memory of why one place was chosen over another. In this sense, caring for children was never only softness. It was one of the most serious tasks of survival, because the future of the group depended on whether the young could receive what the dead, the old, and the experienced had learned. A stone tool in a child's hand was more than an object. It was a lesson in force, angle, patience, and risk. A walk across familiar ground was more than movement. It was a map being placed into the body. A warning repeated many times was more than a command. It was memory being protected from disappearing. The child's mind became a living place where the group stored what it could not write down. This is one reason the question of caring about more than survival cannot be separated from childhood. To teach a child is to believe, in action, if not in words, that tomorrow matters. It is to spend time on someone unfinished. It is to slow the strong hand so a smaller hand can learn. It is to repeat what an adult already knows, because knowledge that is not passed on dies with the knower. The early human world was full of immediate pressures, but children forced those pressures to open toward the future. A meal could end hunger for one evening, but teaching a child where food comes from could protect many evenings not yet lived. A fire could warm the night, but teaching a child how flame behaves could carry warmth into nights after the teacher was gone. A safe path could bring a group home once, but teaching that path could make home return again in another generation. Here, more than survival begins quietly. It does not appear as a grand idea. It appears in repetition, patience, and the strange human willingness to care for a mind that is still forming. The child made the future visible before it arrived, and by caring for children, humans were already caring for a life larger than the present moment. To care for a child is to live with a strange kind of trust. The child is present, hungry, noisy, curious, fragile, and often inconvenient, but the full meaning of that child belongs to a future no one can see clearly. Early humans could not know which child would become a skilled tracker, which child would remember an old route, which child would carry fire carefully, which child would one day hold another child through cold, or which child would preserve a warning after the person who first gave it was gone. Yet the group still had to feed, protect, guide, and tolerate the slow growth of young minds and bodies. This made childhood one of the first places where human life reached beyond the immediate needs of the day. Hunger asks for food now, cold asks for warmth now, danger asks for movement now, but a child asks for years. A child asks for repeated attention, repeated teaching, repeated patience, and repeated protection before the return is clear. In that long delay, survival became stretched across time. The group was not only trying to remain alive until morning, it was trying, in ways perhaps never spoken clearly, to make sure that someone would still know how to live when the present adults were old or gone. This is why children changed the meaning of survival so deeply. They turned knowledge into something that had to be carried forward. They made care into a bridge between bodies that were already strong and bodies that were still becoming strong. They required the group to protect unfinished life, and unfinished life is one of the clearest signs that humans could not survive by immediate usefulness alone. A child who was clumsy with a tool today might become the adult who made better tools later. A child who slowed the group today might become the person who remembered where the group once found water. A child who needed comfort today might become the one who comforted others when fear returned. None of this was guaranteed. Many children in deep prehistory must have faced hardship, illness, hunger, danger, and loss. We should not soften the ancient world into a peaceful dream, but the very existence of long human childhood means that, again and again, groups had to make room for the vulnerable future. The future did not arrive as an idea written into law. It arrived as a small body needing food before it could gather food, needing teaching before it could teach, needing protection before it could protect. Here, the central question of this video becomes clearer, though still not answered completely. When did humans begin to care about more than survival? Perhaps one answer lies in the moment. Survival began to include the protection of what was not yet useful. The child was not only a mouth to feed, the child was a living possibility. The care of children joined the present to the future in a way no tool could do by itself. A sharp stone could cut today. A fire could warm tonight. A shelter could block rain for a while. But a child could carry the memory of all these things into a time when the original hands were gone. To teach a child was to refuse the disappearance of experience. To protect a child was to protect a version of the group that did not exist yet. To comfort a child was to keep fear from becoming the only teacher. These acts were ordinary, repeated, and often unnoticed, but they were also profound. They show that human survival was becoming something deeper than the body's defense against death. It was becoming the careful transfer of life, knowledge, and belonging from one generation to another. In that transfer, humans were not escaping survival. They were widening it until it included memory, patience, and responsibility for lives still unfolding. In a world without writing, an older person could be more than a body that had begun to slow down. Age may have brought weakness, pain, damaged teeth, tired joints, dimmer sight, or a pace that no longer matched the young and strong, but it could also bring something the group could not easily replace: memory. Before maps were drawn, before calendars were written, before knowledge could be stored outside the body, memory lived in people. It lived in the one who remembered where water remained when the dry season lasted too long. It lived in the one who had seen animals move differently before a hard winter. It lived in the one who knew which valley had once been generous, which slope became dangerous after heavy rain, which plant looked harmless but should not be eaten, which stone broke cleanly, and which route looked short but led into trouble. For early humans, such memory was not decoration. It could be the difference between movement and mistake, between caution and loss, between repeating an old danger and avoiding it. This is why the presence of elders matters in the story of when humans began to care about more than survival. An older person might not always bring the greatest physical strength to the group, but survival itself was never only strength. It was timing, recognition, comparison, and the ability to connect what was happening now with what had happened before. A young person might see clouds gathering and only think of rain. Someone older might remember the last time those clouds came from that direction, as the river rose, where the ground softened, which shelter stayed dry, and where the group should not sleep. A young hunter might see a track and think only of the animal ahead. Someone older might remember that this animal changed its path near a certain season, or that following it too far once led people away from water. We should not imagine every elder as wise, or every group as respectful in the same way. That would be too simple, and the deep past does not allow such certainty. But we can say that long experience had value in a world where nothing was written down. A person who had lived through many seasons carried a kind of archive in the body. Their memory was not perfect, and it could fade, but it held patterns that the young had not yet had time to learn. This made age a complicated thing. It could be a burden when movement was hard, but it could also be a resource when decisions depended on remembering more than the present moment. Here, again, survival begins to widen. The group that kept an elder close might have been keeping more than a familiar person. It might have been keeping roots, warnings, names of places, stories of loss, and small practical knowledge that had taken years to gather. In a written world, we can put memory into books, records, signs, and screens. In the older human world, memory had breath. It had a face. It sat near the fire, walked more slowly, pointed toward a ridge, corrected a child's hand, or warned the group not to trust what looked easy. To care for such a person was not only kindness, though it may have included warmth and attachment. It was also a way of protecting knowledge from disappearing. And perhaps this is one of the quiet beginnings of caring about more than survival. The moment a human life became valuable not only for what it could do now, but for what it remembered from before. Memory does not always look powerful from the outside. It does not shine like a sharp tool, burn like a fire, or fill the stomach like food. It can sit quietly inside an aging body, carried in scars, habits, repeated warnings, and the familiar movement of hands that have done the same task many times before. But in a world without writing, memory was one of the deepest forms of protection a group could have. The young could learn quickly, but they could not remember what they had never lived through. They could watch the sky, but they could not compare it to a storm that came many years earlier. They could follow a trail, but they could not know that the same trail once led people too far from water at the wrong time of year. An elder, or simply a person who had lived long enough to see patterns return, could hold those connections. They could remember that a certain plant appeared after rain but became bitter later, that a stream vanished when heat lasted too long, that animals moved higher into the hills before a season changed. or that a cave which looked safe could fill with cold air during the night. None of this was abstract knowledge. It was survival folded into memory. It was the past becoming useful before danger repeated itself. This is why older people, experienced people, and careful rememberers could change the shape of a group's future. They did not need to be the fastest to matter. They did not need to carry the heaviest load to protect others. Their value could appear in a moment of hesitation, when the group might have chosen a dangerous place to sleep, in a warning, when a child reached for the wrong fruit, in a correction, when a young hand struck stone at the wrong angle, in a story, when a loss from long ago helped people avoid losing someone again. A memory like that saved the group from beginning again from ignorance. It turned pain into instruction. It turned old mistakes into quiet guidance. And because no mark on bark, bone, stone, or wall could yet hold the full living detail of what had happened, the person who remembered became a kind of shelter for the group's experience. This connects closely to the question of when humans began to care about more than survival, because memory gave value to lives that were not measured only by immediate force. A person with weak knees might still know where the safer crossing was. A person who tired easily might still remember which season brought hunger earliest. A person who no longer hunted well might still teach the motion that made a tool useful. In the coldest view of survival, only present strength seems to matter. But human survival had a longer memory than that. It had to, because the land was not fully new every morning. Seasons returned. Dangers returned. Opportunities returned. Mistakes returned if no one remembered them. So the group that listened to memory was caring for more than the moment. It was caring for the accumulated life of the group itself. Still, we should keep this honest and calm. We cannot say that every elder in every ancient group was protected, honored, or treated gently. We cannot turn deep time into a single beautiful picture. Some older people may have suffered, been left behind, or lost their place when conditions became too hard. Scarcity can narrow attention. Fear can make decisions cruel. But the wider pattern of human life suggests that remembered experience had real value, especially where knowledge was oral, practical, and carried in bodies rather than written signs. To keep someone who remembered was to keep a bridge to seasons already survived. It was to prevent the group from paying the same price twice for the same lesson. A child could learn from touching fire, but an elder's warning could save the child from the burn. A group could discover a dry valley by suffering through it, but remembered warning could lead them elsewhere before thirst began. In this way, memory softened the world, not by making it safe, but by making it less unknown. And when humans began to protect memory in living people, they were no longer protecting only the bodies that could run fastest or lift most. They were protecting time itself, gathered inside a human voice. The value of memory becomes clearer when we imagine what happens without it. A group without memory must meet every season as if it were new. It must learn every danger again with fresh pain. It must discover every dry path by thirst, every unsafe shelter by cold, every poisonous plant by sickness, every risky crossing by loss. The body can survive one mistake, perhaps two, but a group that forgets too much becomes fragile. This is why memory was not simply something people had. It was something they had to protect. In the deep past, before writing could hold names, warnings, roots, laws, prayers, or histories outside the body, human memory was alive only as long as human beings carried it. When a person died, a part of the group's knowledge could die with them. When an elder was ignored, an old lesson could be lost. When a story was not repeated, a warning could fade until someone paid for it again. This gave certain lives a value that went beyond their immediate physical strength. A person might walk slowly, eat food, need rest, and no longer bring back as much as before, yet still hold something the group could not easily replace. They might remember the year when game disappeared early. They might remember which valley looked empty but held roots beneath the ground. They might remember how a wound was once cleaned, how a tool was repaired, how a child was calmed during a storm, or how a quarrel had once damaged trust. These memories were not separate from survival, but they also reached beyond the body's present hunger. They gave the group a past, and a past changes the meaning of the present. A creature living only in the present reacts. A human group with memory can compare, hesitate, warn, teach, and return. It can say, Not in written words, but through movement and habit, we have seen something like this before. That quiet sentence may have been one of the first ways human life became larger than immediate survival. The remembered past allowed the group to live with more than instinct. It allowed people to carry invisible things. Old losses, old roots, old fears, old skills, old places that still mattered. Here, caring about more than survival begins to look less like an escape from practical life and more like the deepening of it. To care for memory was to care for the group's continuity. To listen to someone older was to let another time speak into the present. To teach what had been remembered was to give the future a better chance than the past had given the first learner. This is why stories, warnings, gestures, and repeated lessons should not be treated as decoration around survival. They were part of the way survival became human, but they also did something more. They helped create belonging, a group that remembered the same place, the same loss, the same difficult winter, or the same path home, was not only a group of bodies moving together, it was a group joined by shared time. The land around them was no longer just space. It was filled with what had happened there. A bend in a river could mean water, but also a remembered accident. A cave mouth could mean shelter, but also a night when a child survived cold. A hill could mean a lookout, but also the place where someone once saw animals returning. Memory placed human meaning onto the world without needing to build a monument. It made ordinary ground thicker with experience. In that sense, elders and rememberers helped humans care about more than the next meal, because they kept the next meal connected to all the meals before it, and all the lives that had made it possible. We should still remain careful. The evidence cannot tell us every feeling, every custom, or every decision. It cannot promise that all old people were protected, or that all memories were valued equally. But the broader pattern is hard to dismiss. Human survival depended on knowledge carried across time, and knowledge across time depended on people. So when a group kept close to someone who remembered, it may have been protecting food, shelter, and safety. But it was also protecting continuity. It was protecting the fragile thread between those who had lived, those who were living, and those who had not yet learned. This may be one of the earliest roots of meaning. Not a sudden idea that life was sacred, not a clear philosophy, not a written belief, but the slow recognition that a human being could hold time inside them, and that losing that person could mean losing part of the world. Death may have been the sharpest boundary in the ancient human world. Hunger could be answered, at least for a while. Cold could be pushed back by fire, shelter, skins, and shared warmth. Injury could sometimes heal. A lost path could sometimes be found again, but death did not return the body to the group. A person who had died no longer gathered food, watched the night, held a child, remembered a route aloud, shaped a tool, warned against danger, or added strength to movement. From the coldest point of view, death seems to end usefulness. The body remains, but the person no longer acts. In a hard world, where energy was costly and time could not be wasted carelessly, this fact must have pressed heavily on early human groups. What should be done with the dead? The practical problems alone were real. A body could attract animals. It could disturb a shelter. It could carry smell, fear, or danger. It could not simply remain forever among the living in the same way. Even before we speak of meaning, grief, memory, or belief, death required action. The group had to move away, cover the body, leave it, place it somewhere, return to it, avoid it, or handle it in some other way shaped by the land, the season, and the condition of the group. But the human question begins, where practical action is not the whole story. If a dead body was only waste, only danger, only an empty thing, then the simplest response would be enough. Yet across the long story of humans and some closely related human groups, there are signs that the dead were not always treated as nothing. We must be careful with this. The deep past does not give us a clear voice saying what people believed. A body placed in the ground may have been protected intentionally or covered by natural processes. Objects found near remains may have had meaning, or may have arrived there by accident, disturbance, or later movement. A careful position may reflect choice, but interpretation is never simple. To speak honestly, we should not rush to call every ancient burial a religion, every object a gift, or every placement a ritual. But even with caution, death opens a doorway into the central question of this video. When a person was gone, why did the living still respond? Why did some bodies remain within attention after they could no longer help the group survive in any direct way? A dead person could not bring food back tomorrow. A dead person could not remember aloud. A dead person could not take a child by the hand or keep embers alive through the night. And yet the living may still have felt the weight of that person's presence, because human presence does not vanish from the mind as quickly as breath leaves the body. The dead may have remained in memory, in place, in fear, in attachment, in the repeated awareness that someone who had been part of the group was now absent. This absence itself could become powerful. It changed the space around the living. It made a familiar shelter feel different. It made a path quieter. It made a child ask, in whatever early form such asking took, where someone had gone. We cannot know the words. We cannot know the full feelings, but we can understand the problem death created for a remembering species. Humans did not only lose a body, they lost a voice, a relationship, a history, and a place in the group's pattern. This is why death belongs in the story of caring about more than survival. It forced early humans to face someone who no longer served survival, yet still mattered in some way to the living. The dead body marked a difficult truth. A human life could continue inside others after the body had stopped, not as a proven belief, not as a doctrine, not as a finished idea, but as memory, absence, and attention. In that quiet space, survival began to touch something deeper. The living still had to eat. They still had to move. They still had to protect children, fire, and shelter. But now they also had to carry the fact that one of their own was no longer there, and carrying that fact may have been one of the earliest ways human life became more than the protection of breathing bodies. The evidence around ancient death is some of the most moving, and also some of the easiest to misunderstand. A skeleton found in the ground can invite us to imagine grief, ceremony, farewell, or belief. But the earth does not always tell its story clearly. A body may be buried by human hands, or covered slowly by sediment, cave fall, flooding, animal activity, or time. Bones may shift, objects may move. Later disturbance can change what seems, at first glance, like an intentional arrangement. This is why we have to speak carefully. The question is not whether every ancient body found in the ground proves ritual. It does not. The question is whether, across enough places and enough traces, we can see that some human groups began to treat the dead in ways that were not purely accidental. Even then, we should not jump too quickly to modern words. Burial does not automatically mean religion. A placed body does not automatically mean a belief in an afterlife. Red pigment does not automatically mean a sacred symbol. A stone tool near a body does not always mean a gift. The honest path is slower. We can say that, in some cases, the dead appear to have been given attention. A body may have been placed in a certain position, a grave may have been made or protected, a place may have been returned to. A dead person may have remained close enough to the living world that their absence had to be handled, not ignored. That is already important, because it shows that death could become more than a biological ending. It could become a social event. The dead person was no longer breathing, but the living still had to decide what kind of place that person would have now. Outside the body, the person could no longer act. Inside the minds of others, the person had not vanished. This is one of the quietest and deepest changes in human life. A creature that only reacts to immediate danger can leave a dead body and continue. A remembering group carries the dead differently. It may carry fear of the body, attachment to the person, memory of shared food, memory of a voice, memory of a skill, memory of a child once held, or simply the strange pressure of absence. When the dead are treated with attention, even practical attention, the living are admitting through action that a human life does not become nothing the instant it stops moving. Again, this does not require us to claim too much. Practical reasons may have shaped many responses to death. Covering a body may protect the living from smell or animals. Moving a body may keep a shelter usable. Placing remains in a particular area may solve a problem of space. But practical acts can gather meaning through repetition. A place where the dead are placed can become remembered. A body covered by hands can become part of a pattern. A return to a location can make the land feel different. Death changes a group's relationship with place, because the ground no longer holds only shelter, stone, plants, and animal tracks. It may also hold someone who was once inside the circle of life. This is where survival and meaning come very close together. The living still needed to protect themselves. They still needed to avoid disease, animals, and danger. They still needed to move when food ran low, but if they paused, if they handled the dead carefully, if they remembered where someone lay, if they returned to a place because of a person no longer alive, then human attention had stretched beyond the immediate body. The dead could not repay the effort. They could not thank, warn, feed, or teach. Yet they could still shape behavior. Their absence could organize memory. Their resting place could mark the land. Their former life could remain part of the group's story. In that sense, death may have helped humans discover that survival was not the only thing the mind needed to hold. The mind also needed to hold loss. It needed to hold continuity between the living and those who had disappeared. It needed to hold the unsettling fact that someone could be gone and still matter. This is not a finished doctrine. It is not yet a temple, a scripture, or a formal ceremony. It is something quieter and older, the living turning toward the dead long enough to make a choice. Not always, not everywhere, not in one single way, but enough to suggest that, somewhere in the long human past, the dead began to occupy a place that was neither fully useful nor fully forgotten. And when that happened, the human world became larger than survival alone, because it now included memory of those who could no longer survive. When the dead remained in memory, human life became heavier and wider at the same time. A group could leave a body behind, but it could not always leave behind the person as if nothing had happened. Someone who had once walked with the group might still appear in the habits of those who survived, in the route they remembered, in the tool stroke they had taught, in the child who looked toward the empty place near the fire, in the warning repeated with their voice no longer there to say it. Death removed the body from usefulness, but it did not remove the shape that person had left inside other minds. This is why the treatment of the dead belongs so deeply to the question of caring about more than survival. The dead could not help gather food. They could not protect the shelter. They could not hold the fire through the night. They could not carry a child or point toward water. Yet they might still matter because humans were not only creatures of hunger, they were creatures of memory. They could hold absence. They could notice that a familiar person was no longer where they had been. They could carry the strange feeling that life had continued, but not in the same form. We should not turn this too quickly into a complete belief system. It is better to remain close to what can be said with care. The earliest attention to the dead may have been practical, emotional, social, symbolic, or some mixture we cannot separate anymore. It may have changed from group to group, place to place, and time to time. Some bodies may have been left without ceremony. Some may have been moved for practical reasons. Some may have been placed carefully because the living were responding to memory, fear, attachment, respect, or meanings that are now beyond our reach. The deep past does not give us a single answer, but it gives us a human problem. What does a group do when someone who was part of its life is no longer alive, yet not easily erased? This problem could not be solved by food alone. It could not be solved by warmth alone. It asked the mind to hold two truths at once. The person is gone, and the person still matters. That tension may be one of the oldest roots of meaning. A dead person no longer survives, but the living may still protect the memory of that person. Avoid stepping carelessly over their remains. Return to a place where they were left, or speak of them in whatever early forms of sound, gesture, or story were possible. Even if the first responses were small, they changed the human world. The land became marked not only by food and danger, but by absence. A shelter could remember someone. A path could feel connected to someone. A place in the ground could hold more than soil and bone. It could hold a relationship that had crossed the boundary between presence and loss. This is where survival becomes too narrow a word. Survival keeps the living body moving, but memory keeps a life from disappearing completely inside the minds of others. The living still had to eat the next meal. They still had to protect the children, carry the tools, watch the weather, and move when the season demanded it. But after death entered human memory, life was no longer only a chain of immediate needs. It also included what had been loved, feared, learned, lost, and carried forward. A group that remembered its dead was not escaping the hard world. It was placing human experience inside time. It was saying, without needing a written language, that a life can leave a trace beyond its final breath. And perhaps this is why death, though it seems to end survival, may have helped humans care about more than survival. It forced them to face value without usefulness. It showed them a person who could no longer act, yet could still shape thought, movement, place, and memory. It made absence part of the human world. By the time the living turned back toward the fire, gathered food again, lifted children again, and followed the old paths again, they may have carried something that no animal hunger could explain completely. The memory of one who was gone, and the quiet awareness that surviving was not the same as forgetting. There is another kind of trace that changes how we look at early human life, and it begins with the hand doing something that is not only cutting, carrying, digging, scraping, or breaking. At some point in the long human past, hands also began to make marks, prepare colours, shape small objects, and leave signs that did not feed the body in any direct way. A line on a piece of ochre does not fill the stomach. A red stain on skin or stone does not keep the rain away by itself. A small pierced shell, a pattern, a repeated mark, or a coloured surface cannot run faster than danger or make a winter warm. From the coldest view of survival, such things look unnecessary, and yet they appear in the human story with a persistence that asks us to slow down. We should be careful with the word art, because it can make us imagine museums, decoration, personal expression, or beauty in a modern sense. The earliest marks and pigments may have meant many things, and some may have been practical, social, symbolic, playful, bodily, or connected to group identity in ways we cannot fully recover. A colour used on skin might have signalled belonging, attention, maturity, memory, attraction, status, or something simpler and more practical. A mark on stone might have been a pattern, a count, a sign, an experiment, or an act whose meaning has disappeared with the people who made it. The deep past does not give us a clear caption under each object. But the important point is not that we can translate every mark. The important point is that matter began to carry attention. Stone was no longer only something to strike into a blade. Bone was no longer only remains or raw material. Shell was no longer only part of a shore. Pigment was no longer only coloured earth. These things could be chosen, handled, carried, shaped, arranged, and perhaps remembered because they meant something inside human life. This connects directly to the question of when humans began to care about more than survival, because a mark is a quiet refusal to let the world remain only useful. To make a mark is to take time away from immediate hunger and place attention onto a surface. To carry pigment is to value something that may not be food, fuel, or shelter. To pierce a shell or repeat a pattern is to do something with the body that speaks beyond the body's simplest needs. Again, this does not mean early humans were free from danger or living in comfort. It may be the opposite. The marks may have mattered because life was dangerous, because memory was fragile, because groups needed signs of belonging, because people needed ways to recognize one another, remember places, or hold meaning when words alone could not remain. A group moving through a hard landscape might still carry red earth. A person with little certainty about tomorrow might still shape a small object. A hand that knew hunger might still draw a line. That is the quiet paradox at the heart of this part of the story. The more costly time and energy were, the more interesting it becomes when humans spent them on signs. They were not abandoning survival, they were placing another layer over it. A body needs food, but a human group may also need recognition. A body needs shelter, but a human mind may also need a way to remember. A body needs warmth, but people living together may also need signs that say, in some form, this is us, this matters, this happened, this belongs here. The first marks do not give us a full answer. They do not tell us exactly what early humans believed or felt, but they show that the human hand was beginning to move between the practical and the meaningful. The same hand that struck stone for cutting could touch colour. The same eye that watched tracks in mud could notice pattern. The same mind that remembered danger could begin to leave a trace outside itself. In that moment, however small and uncertain, survival widened again. It did not disappear. It became joined to sign, memory, and the first quiet possibility that the world could be more than something to endure. Pigment, ornament, and repeated marks are easy to underestimate because they are small. A piece of red ochre can look like coloured earth. A pierced shell can look like a simple object. A scratched line can look like nothing more than a hand moving across a surface. But in the long story of humans, these small things matter because they show attention moving beyond immediate use. Ochre could be ground, carried, mixed, rubbed onto skin, placed on objects, or applied to surfaces. Shells could be collected from certain places, shaped, pierced, worn, exchanged, or kept. Marks could be repeated, grouped, placed where others might see them, or hidden in ways that still mattered to the maker. None of this needs to be exaggerated. We should not say every colour was sacred, every shell was jewellery in the modern sense, or every mark was a message we can read. That would be too confident. But we can say that these materials were not chosen randomly in many cases. They required attention. They required time. They required the mind to see more in an object than its simplest physical use. A stone tool cuts because of its edge. A fire warms because of heat. A shelter protects because of shape. But a coloured mark, a worn shell, or a repeated pattern works differently. Its power, if we may use that word carefully, depends on recognition. Someone has to notice it. Someone has to remember it. Someone has to understand, or at least feel, that it belongs to a person, a group, a place, a moment, or a repeated habit. This is where material things begin to carry social meaning. A mark may say, not in a sentence, but through presence, that a human hand was here. A pigment may show that a body is not only a body, but a body presented to others. An ornament may help one person become recognizable to another. A repeated form may help a group hold memory outside the mind for a little while. These possibilities are difficult to prove in every case, and they almost certainly varied across time and place. But the pattern is important. Humans began to treat matter as if it could hold more than function. This connects directly to the question of when humans began to care about more than survival, because symbol-like behavior suggests that people were not only reacting to hunger, cold, and danger, they were also living in a world of signs. A sign is not the same as food. It does not satisfy the stomach. It does not stop rain. Yet signs can help create belonging, difference, memory, attention, warning, beauty, status, or shared identity. A small object worn on the body might tell others something about the wearer, even if we no longer know what. A red surface might mark a moment, a place, a body, or an act. A pattern might help the mind return to something that would otherwise fade. In a world without writing, signs did not need to be complex to matter. Even a repeated colour or object could help people recognize continuity. The same group, the same place, the same kind of action, the same remembered meaning. Survival became broader when humans began to care not only about what an object could do physically, but what it could mean socially. A shell that could not cut meat might still connect a person to a shoreline, a memory, another person, or a group identity. Pigment that could not feed a child might still be used on the body of someone living, or perhaps near someone dead, turning colour into a trace of attention. A mark that could not make warmth might still remain after the hand was gone, leaving the world slightly changed by intention. This is not a small shift. It means the human mind was beginning to place invisible value into visible things. The object itself remained ordinary: earth, shell, stone, bone, surface. But human attention made it more than ordinary. That is one of the quiet foundations of culture. Culture does not begin only with great monuments, formal ceremonies, or written myths. It begins whenever a group repeatedly treats something as meaningful because people recognize it together. The first signs may have been simple, uncertain, and deeply tied to daily life, but they opened a new layer of existence. People could now carry belonging on the body, place memory onto surfaces, and let chosen materials speak in ways that ordinary tools did not. In that sense, pigment and marks were not escapes from survival. They were survival becoming humanly textured. The body still needed food, warmth, and safety. But the human world now also needed recognition, shared attention, and traces that helped memory stay alive beyond a single moment. Somewhere in these small coloured, scratched, carried, and worn things, we can see the human mind beginning to care not only about staying alive, but about what life meant while it was being lived. A mark does not have to be large to change the human world. It can be a line, a stain, a notch, a repeated shape, a coloured hand, a pierced shell, or a small object carried from one place to another. From a distance, these things can seem almost weightless beside hunger, cold, illness, and danger. But their importance lies in the way they allowed something invisible to become visible. A thought could touch a surface, a memory could gather around a colour, a group could recognise itself through an object, a place could become different because a human hand had marked it. This is where the question of more than survival becomes especially clear. A useful tool changes what the hand can do to the world. A sign changes what the world can hold for the mind. If a stone blade helps a person cut meat, scrape hide, or shape wood, its value is direct. But if a pattern is repeated, if a colour is chosen, if a shell is carried or worn, its value depends on attention shared between people. It asks to be noticed. It asks to be remembered. It may point to belonging, identity, memory, status, play, loss, place, or something we can no longer name. We should not pretend to translate these early signs with certainty. The meanings have mostly vanished, and different groups may have used the same materials in very different ways. But even uncertainty does not erase the larger pattern. Humans were beginning to place significance into things that did not keep the body alive by force alone. This may be one of the quietest thresholds in our story. To care about a sign is to care about recognition. To repeat a mark is to care that something remains. To carry a chosen object is to care that a connection travels with the body. To use pigment is to care that appearance, memory, or attention can matter. None of these acts frees a person from hunger. None of them makes the night less cold in the simple physical sense. Yet they change the experience of being human inside hunger and cold. They give the group a way to say, without writing and perhaps without fixed words, that this person, this place, this moment, or this belonging is not the same as everything else. In a world where so much could disappear, a mark was a small act of holding. It held attention on a surface. It held a gesture after the hand had moved away. It held the possibility that another person might see and understand, or at least feel that someone had been there before. This is why marks, pigments, and ornaments are not merely decorative in the larger history of human life. They show that survival had begun to include memory outside the body. Earlier memory lived mostly in people, in elders, in teachers, in repeated stories, in watched movements, in familiar paths. But a mark allowed memory to lean against the world itself. It was fragile, partial, and often unclear, but it was still a trace. A person could leave something behind. A group could return to a surface and find that the past had not fully disappeared. A child could see a repeated sign before understanding its full meaning. The land could hold evidence of attention. This does not mean the beginning of writing, not yet. It does not mean a complete symbolic system with fixed meanings we can read. It means something older and softer. The world had begun to receive human intention in forms that lasted longer than breath. And once humans began doing that, the boundary around survival widened again. They were not only preserving food, fire, shelter, and bodies. They were preserving hints of identity, memory, belonging, and presence. A life could now leave a trace not only in another person's mind, but on an object, a surface, a colour, or a chosen thing carried close to the skin. That is why these quiet signs matter so much. They show the human mind beginning to protect what could not be eaten, worn for warmth, or used as a weapon. They show a concern for meaning while life was still difficult. They remind us that humans did not wait until the world was safe before making it significant. Even in landscapes of hunger, weather, movement and loss. The hand could pause long enough to mark, colour, shape, and carry. And in that pause, the world was no longer only a place to survive. It was becoming a place where human attention could remain. A place is not the same as a space. Space can be crossed, used, entered, or left behind. A place has begun to gather memory. For early humans, the land was first a matter of survival in the most direct sense. A cave mouth could mean shelter from wind and rain. A rock overhang could mean a dry place to sleep. A river bend could mean water, fish, animal tracks, plants, and movement. A ridge could mean visibility. A valley could mean warmth, danger, or a path followed by herds. A stand of trees could mean fuel, shade, material, or concealment. At first, these meanings seem entirely practical. The land mattered because bodies needed protection, food, water, warmth, and safe movement. But when humans returned to the same places again and again, those places could become more than useful. They could become familiar. A shelter was not only stone above the head, it was the place where a child had survived a cold night. A river was not only water, it was where people had crossed before, where someone had slipped, where animals came at a certain season, where the group learned to wait or move. A hill was not only high ground, it was where weather could be seen coming, where smoke from another fire might be noticed, where someone remembered standing with a person who was now gone. This is where the land began to hold human time. In a purely immediate sense, survival asks, where is food? Where is water? Where is safety? Where is danger? But a remembering mind asks more. It asks, where have we been before? What happened here? Who knew this place? What should be avoided because of what once occurred? What can be trusted because it has held us before? These questions do not need writing. They can live in gestures, routes, warnings, habits, and stories repeated while walking. A group may return to a place because it is useful, but repeated return changes the relationship. The ground becomes layered with experience. The same cave wall can hold smoke from older fires. The same path can carry footsteps of children who later become adults. The same water source can become part of a group's expectation of the season. The same shelter can be remembered not only for protection, but for the people who once gathered there. This connects directly to the question of when humans began to care about more than survival, because place shows how usefulness can slowly become meaning. A cave keeps rain away, but a remembered cave can also hold belonging. A path leads through land, but a remembered path can hold instruction. A river gives water, but a remembered river can hold caution, loss, and return. The land did not need to be sacred in a formal sense to become meaningful. It only needed to be lived in, returned to, and remembered. We should be careful not to imagine every ancient shelter as a shrine, or every repeated campsite as a place of deep symbolic meaning. Many places were probably chosen simply because they worked. They were dry, visible, near food, near stone, near water, or safe enough for a time. But human memory does not leave usefulness untouched. Once people live through hunger, birth, injury, teaching, fear, rest, death, and recovery in a place, that place can begin to carry more than its physical shape. It becomes part of the group's inner map. And an inner map is never only geography. It is geography joined to memory. In this way, early humans did not need cities to begin caring about place. They did not need permanent houses, borders, names carved into stone, or fields divided by walls. A place could matter because it had sheltered them before. It could matter because an elder remembered it. It could matter because children learned the way to it. It could matter because someone was buried nearby, or because a mark was left there, or because returning to it made the world feel less unknown. Survival needed locations, but the human mind turned some locations into places. And once that happened, humans were no longer moving through an empty landscape of resources alone. They were moving through a remembered world where food, danger, loss, shelter, and belonging could gather in the same ground. When a group returns to the same place many times, the land begins to speak through memory. Not in words, not in writing, and not in any way we should turn too quickly into myth or formal belief, but through the quiet force of recognition. A bend in the river is no longer just a bend in the river if people remember that fish gathered there after the rains. A slope is no longer just a slope if an elder once warned that loose stones fall after frost. A cave mouth is no longer just shelter if several generations have watched firelight move across the same wall. A stand of trees is no longer only wood and shade if children learn there which branches smoke too much and which ones burn cleanly. The body uses a place, but memory returns to it. That return changes the human relationship with the world. The land becomes less like a flat surface of resources and more like a living pattern of remembered events. Early humans moving through such a world were not simply wandering from one useful location to another. They were moving through a landscape that could hold instructions, dangers, comforts, losses, and expectations. A path might be followed because it was efficient, but also because it was known. A shelter might be chosen because it was dry, but also because it had held the group safely before. A water source might be visited because thirst required it, but also because the group knew how the animals came there, how the mud changed, how the current behaved, and where a careless step could be dangerous. This is survival, but it is survival deepened by remembered place. It is not just the present body asking what it needs now. It is the group's past guiding the body through the present. This matters for the question of when humans began to care about more than survival, because repeated return creates attachment even when the first reason for returning is practical. A place that helps you live can become a place you trust. A place where someone recovered from sickness can become a place associated with relief. A place where a child first learned to walk safely over stone can become part of that child's earliest map of belonging. A place where someone died can become quieter in memory than the ground around it. None of this requires a permanent village. It does not require agriculture, walls, temples, or written names. Long before those things, a temporary shelter could still be remembered, a seasonal camp could still gather meaning, a hunting path could still become familiar enough to feel inherited. Humans did not need to stay forever in one location for location to matter. Returning was enough. Remembering was enough. Teaching the way to someone younger was enough. Over time, the land itself could become a kind of memory system. The river reminded the group where fish came. The cliff reminded them where wind struck hardest. The cave reminded them of smoke, warmth, fear, rest, and voices. The path reminded them of those who had walked it before. In this way, place helped humans carry more than tools. It helped them carry the past without writing. A mark on a wall can hold one kind of trace, but a remembered place can hold many traces at once. The route taken, the body buried, the child taught, the fire kept, the danger avoided, the animal followed, the hunger endured. When people returned, they did not return only to stone, soil, and water. They returned to the layered memory of living there. We should remain careful, because not every repeated campsite was emotionally charged, and not every old path was meaningful in the same way. Some places were likely used and left with little attachment. Some were chosen because they were simply convenient. But human minds are built to connect experience with surroundings. A sound, a smell, a bend in a path, the shape of a hill at dusk, the way smoke gathers under an overhang, these things can pull memory back into the present. For early humans, whose knowledge was held in bodies and stories rather than written records, such place memory may have been one of the strongest ways to organize life. It helped people know where to go, when to return, what to avoid, and what had happened before. And once a place held what had happened before, it could also hold value beyond immediate usefulness. It could become part of who the group was. To lose such a place might mean losing more than shelter. It might mean losing a memory, a route, a teaching ground, a resting place, or a connection to those no longer walking. So when humans began to care about places not only because they were useful today, but because they carried yesterday and guided tomorrow, survival had widened again. The world was no longer only something outside the human body. It had become a partner in memory, a quiet holder of belonging, and a map of meanings laid gently over the map of food and danger. A human place begins when memory settles onto the land. The same ground can feed the body and hold the past at the same time. A river can be water, but it can also be the place where a group learned to cross carefully. A cave can be shelter, but it can also be the place where smoke darkened the ceiling over many nights of fear and rest. A path can be movement, but it can also be the line by which children learned where their people had gone before. This is the quiet difference between using a landscape and belonging, even temporarily, inside it. Early humans did not need permanent villages to feed them. The weight of place. They did not need fields, fences, temples, or carved boundary stones. A place could matter because the group had returned there in hunger and found food, returned there in cold and found shelter, returned there after loss and found enough safety to continue. The first layer was practical, but the next layer was memory. The human mind does not keep those layers fully separate. If a place saved life once, it may be approached differently the next time. If a place held death once, it may never feel empty again. If a place taught children, protected fire, or gathered people through winter rain, then it began to carry something that could not be measured only in calories, stone, wood, or water. This is why place is so important to the question of caring about more than survival. A body survives in space, but a human group remembers in place. Space can be useful without being loved or feared. Place becomes part of the inner life of a group. It can be pointed to, warned about, returned to, avoided, missed, taught, and carried in story. A remembered shelter can become a promise that the world is not entirely unknown. A remembered danger can become a warning that saves someone who was not alive when the danger first happened. A remembered path can let a young person step into the knowledge of older feet. In this way, place allowed human life to stretch across time without needing writing. The ground became a kind of silent record, not because it explained itself, but because people carried meanings back to it. When an elder pointed toward a ridge, the ridge was not only rock, it was memory made visible. When a parent guided a child along a route, the route was not only distance, it was inheritance under the feet. When a group paused near the place where someone had died, the place was not only soil, it was absence held in the world. None of this means every place was sacred, or that early humans had fixed beliefs about land in the way later cultures would. We should not place later ideas too confidently onto ancient lives, but we can say that repeated living changes the meaning of surroundings. The land becomes familiar through use, and familiarity becomes powerful through memory. Humans began to care about more than survival when the world around them stopped being only a set of resources and became a remembered world. Food still mattered, water still mattered, shelter still mattered, but the place where food was found could also become part of a story. The place where water remained could become part of trust. The shelter that held the group could become part of belonging. This widening was quiet but profound. It meant that the human mind was no longer only asking, what can this place give us now? It could also ask, what happened here before? Who brought us here? Who is missing from this place? What should we remember when we return? These questions do not need to be spoken in modern language to shape behavior. They can live in pauses, in roots, in repeated warnings, in the way a group chooses one overhang instead of another, in the way children are shown where to step, in the way a fire is placed where fire has been placed before. Survival became more than movement through an empty world. It became return. It became recognition. It became the slow making of a world that held human traces. And perhaps this is one of the clearest signs that humans were beginning to care beyond immediate survival. They did not only try to stay alive somewhere, they began to live as if somewhere could matter. Before writing existed, a human group still had to carry things that could not be held in the hand. A stone tool could be passed from one person to another. A piece of meat could be shared. A bundle of wood could be carried. A child could hold a shell, a bone point, or a scraping tool and learn its weight by touch. But the most important things were often invisible. A warning could not be stored like food unless someone remembered it. A route could not be kept beside the fire unless someone carried it in the mind. A mistake could not teach the next generation unless it was repeated, shown, acted out, or woven into some form of telling. This is why story belongs so closely to the question of when humans began to care about more than survival. Story, in its earliest sense, does not have to mean entertainment. It does not have to mean a long tale with a clear beginning and ending. It may have been a warning, a repeated memory, a gesture joined to sound, a familiar account of where not to go. a way of explaining why the group returns to one place and avoids another. It may have been simple, practical, and closely tied to the land, but even in that simple form, telling allowed humans to carry what the body alone could not carry. A person who had seen danger could make that danger useful to someone who had not seen it. A person who had survived hunger in one season could help others prepare when a similar season returned. A person who remembered a death near a crossing could make the crossing feel different for children born later. Through telling, experience could travel beyond the single body that first lived it. This was not separate from survival, but it was more than the body's immediate defense. It was survival turned into shared memory. A group without telling would have to learn too much from direct pain. Each child would have to discover danger by touching it, eating it, following it, or falling into it. Each young adult would have to test every path as if no one had walked before. Each season would arrive with fewer warnings from the past. But a group that told, showed, repeated, and remembered could let one life teach many lives. That is a profound change. It means a single event did not have to disappear when the person who lived it grew old or died. It could move into other minds. It could be reshaped, simplified, repeated, and carried forward. We should be careful, because we cannot reconstruct the earlier stories in full. We do not know their exact sounds, their rhythms, their images, or the boundaries between gesture, song, warning, and memory. Deep prehistory does not preserve voices the way it preserves stone. But we can still understand why telling would matter in a world without writing. A story could hold a route when there was no map. It could hold a danger when there was no signpost. It could hold a loss when there was no grave marker clear enough for every later child to understand. It could hold the identity of the group when there was no written name. In this way, story became a kind of shelter for experience. It protected knowledge from vanishing too quickly. It allowed the living to learn from the absent, the young to learn from the old, and the future to receive something from the past. This connects directly to the center of the video, because caring about more than survival begins whenever humans protect not only life, but the meaning of what life has passed through. A warning about a dangerous river is practical, but when it is repeated because someone was lost there, it also carries memory. A tale about animals moving with the season may help people find food, but it also teaches children to see the land as patterned, not random. A remembered account of a hard winter may help the group prepare, but it also binds people together around what they have endured. Story gave human survival a longer reach. The body lives in the present. Story lets the past keep speaking. And once the past could speak through human voices, survival was no longer trapped inside one moment. It became something carried, shared, and gently shaped by those who remembered. A story can keep walking after the person who first lived it has stopped walking. That is one of the quiet powers of human life. In a world without writing, a warning could survive only if someone carried it in memory and gave it again to another mind. A child who had never seen a river flood could still learn to fear the low bank when the clouds gathered. A young hunter who had never followed an animal too far could still learn that hunger can pull a person away from water. A group that had not yet faced a certain winter could still prepare because someone remembered a winter before it. In this way, story allowed experience to move beyond the body that suffered, learned, or noticed it first. The event itself was gone. The storm had passed. The hunger had ended. The person who made the mistake might be old or dead, but the memory could remain active, shaping the next decision. This is why telling was not merely a way to pass time near the fire. It could be one of the oldest ways humans protected themselves from the limits of one life. A single person can only live through a small number of seasons. A group, through memory and telling, can live through many more. It can carry a danger from one generation into another. It can preserve a route long after the first feet found it. It can keep the meaning of a place alive, even when the land itself says nothing. This made human survival different from simple reaction. Reaction belongs to the moment. Story belongs to time. When a person tells what happened before, the past enters the present and changes what the living are willing to do. They may choose a different path, gather earlier, leave sooner, wait longer, avoid a tempting place, or trust an old shelter because memory has been carried forward. This is more than survival in the narrow sense, because it protects not only the body, but the lesson inside what happened to bodies before. A story can hold pain without making everyone repeat it. It can turn one person's fear into many people's caution. It can turn one group's loss into a warning for children who were not yet born when the loss occurred. We should keep the word story broad and gentle here. We do not need to imagine long, dramatic tales with fixed plots, heroes, and endings. The earliest forms may have been fragments, a repeated sound, a gesture toward a ridge, a remembered name for a place, a warning said in the same way each time, a movement of the hand showing how water rose, an imitation of an animal's behavior, a rhythm that helped children remember what should not be forgotten. What matters is not the form. What matters is that experience was being carried between people. The group was no longer limited to what each living person had personally seen. It could borrow the eyes of those who had seen before. This gave children a special place in the life of story. They did not only receive food and protection. They received a world already interpreted by others. A bare cliff became the cliff where stones fall after rain. A dark hollow became the place not to sleep when cold air gathers. A certain tree line became the sign that water was near. A patch of ground became the place where someone once vanished from sight. Through telling, the land grew full of invisible instructions. Children learned not only where things were, but why they mattered. They inherited caution, hope, fear, skill, and belonging before they could test all of it for themselves. Here again, the question at the center of this video becomes clearer. Humans began to care about more than survival when they cared enough to preserve experience beyond its immediate usefulness. A warning given once can save one person. A warning remembered and repeated can shape a whole group's future. A loss suffered silently may vanish with the sufferer. A loss told carefully can become part of the group's memory, not to create fear for its own sake, but to keep the living more aware. A place visited once may be only a place. A place named, described, and remembered becomes part of a shared world. Story helped humans carry what bodies could not carry alone. The weight of the past, the meaning of danger, the reasons behind trust, and the presence of those no longer there. It did not remove hunger or cold. It did not make early life safe, but it gave human beings a way to let the past protect the future. And once a group began to live with the past, speaking through memory, survival had become something larger than the next breath. It had become a long conversation between those who had lived, those who were living, and those still learning how to live. Story was not only a way to remember danger, it was also a way to keep a group joined through time. Before writing, before carved records, before names could be fixed on stone or clay, human beings still needed to know who they were with, where they had come from, what had happened to them, what should be feared, what should be trusted, and what should be repeated. A group does not stay together only because bodies stand near one another. Bodies can gather by accident. Bodies can scatter when hunger becomes severe or danger comes close. What holds a human group more deeply is shared memory, the sense that some things are known together, carried together, and returned to together. Story helped create that shared memory. It could remind people of a place where food had once been found, but also of the people who found it. It could warn children about a dangerous crossing, but also carry the memory of someone lost there. It could explain why the group moved when the season changed, why a certain shelter was chosen, why a certain animal was followed carefully, why a certain sound in the dark made adults stop speaking. These were not separate from survival. They helped the group live, but they also gave survival a human shape. A warning becomes different when it carries a remembered life inside it. A route becomes different when it is not only a path, but the path taken by parents, elders, and those who are gone. A shelter becomes different when it is not only dry stone, but the place where stories have been repeated until children know them before they fully understand them. In this way, story made the world thicker. It added invisible layers to visible things. The land held water, wood, stone, and animal tracks, but through story it also held memory, caution, belonging, and loss. This is why storytelling should not be treated as entertainment added after survival was secure. For early humans, telling may have been one of the ways survival itself became continuous. A group that tells can turn one person's knowledge into everyone's knowledge. It can turn one season's pain into another season's preparation. It can turn a dead person's experience into a living child's caution. It can let the past remain useful, not because the past is still happening, but because it has been carried forward in a form the living can use. Yet story does more than preserve practical lessons. It also helps people feel that life has a pattern. A child who hears the same warning again and again does not only learn where not to step. The child learns that others are watching, that the world has been known before, that fear can be named, that danger can be remembered, and that the group has endured things before this moment. That feeling matters. In a hard world, where weather, hunger, illness and death could arrive without explanation, story gave people a way to hold experience without letting it vanish into confusion. It did not have to answer every question. It did not have to become myth in the later formal sense. It only had to gather memory into a shape that could be passed on. This connects directly to the question of when humans began to care about more than survival, because story shows humans protecting not only bodies but meaning. They protected the meaning of a loss by telling where it happened. They protected the meaning of a skill by showing how it was learned. They protected the meaning of a place by returning to it in memory even when they were far away. They protected the meaning of belonging by repeating what the group had lived through together. A body can survive without knowing its history for one day, but a human group becomes fragile if nothing is remembered beyond hunger. Without story, each generation stands too close to the edge of forgetting. With story, the group can hand forward what cannot be placed in a basket or tied with sinew: caution, identity, gratitude, grief, trust, and the quiet knowledge that others lived before and left something behind. This is not a grand conclusion yet. It is only another step in the long widening of survival. First, humans protected bodies. Then they protected children, the weak, memory, the dead, signs, places, and the experiences that connected all of these together. Story was one of the threads binding them. It allowed life to continue not only through birth, food, and movement, but through remembered meaning. And when humans began to carry meaning from one voice to another, survival was no longer only the struggle to remain alive. It was becoming the shared effort to keep life understandable, teachable, and connected across time. There was probably no single morning when humans woke and began to care about more than survival. No one moment can be pointed to with certainty and called the beginning. The deep past does not preserve a clean line between before and after, between bodies that only survived and minds that suddenly made meaning. What it gives us instead is a slow pattern, uneven, incomplete, and spread across many kinds of evidence. A healed injury here. A child's long dependence everywhere. An older person's memory held inside a group. A dead body treated with attention. A pigment carried, ground, or placed on a surface. A shell chosen and pierced. A mark repeated. A shelter returned to. A path remembered. A warning told again after the danger itself had passed. None of these signs alone can carry the whole answer. Each one is partial. Each one requires caution. A healed bone does not tell us exactly who helped. A burial does not automatically prove belief. A mark does not translate itself. A shell does not explain why it mattered. A familiar place does not announce what people felt when they returned. But together, these traces suggest something important. Human life widened gradually. It did not move from survival to meaning in a single step. Meaning seems to have grown inside survival. Wherever survival required memory, patience, attention, teaching, loss, belonging, and care. This is why the question when is difficult. If we ask for a date, the answer becomes uncertain and narrow. We can mention broad evidence from deep time, but we cannot honestly say that on one exact day or in one exact valley, the human mind crossed the line. Evolution does not usually work that way. Culture does not usually work that way. The change was more like a river spreading through many channels. Some channels were practical. People shared food because bodies needed food. They watched children because children could not survive alone. They listened to elders because remembered experience could prevent mistakes. They handled the dead because a body created practical and emotional problems. They marked surfaces or carried objects because recognition, memory, identity, or repeated attention had begun to matter. Each act may have had ordinary reasons. Yet, ordinary reasons can slowly build extraordinary consequences. A child protected today becomes a future carrier of knowledge. A weak person supported today reveals that value is not always immediate strength. A remembered dead person shows that a life can remain meaningful after usefulness has ended. A repeated story lets the past speak into the present. A place returned to becomes more than shelter. A sign left behind lets attention remain outside the body. In all of these, humans did not escape survival. They made survival larger. They stretched it across time, across relationships, across memory, across land, and across generations. The earliest people did not need to invent modern philosophy to do this. They only needed to live in groups where one life depended on another, where children took years to grow, where knowledge could be lost if no one carried it, where death left absence in the minds of the living, and where the same places were returned to often enough to become familiar. From those conditions, care could emerge without needing to be named. Meaning could gather without needing a temple. Responsibility could appear before written law. A sense of belonging could form before permanent villages. That is why this final part of the story begins not with a dramatic discovery, but with a refusal to oversimplify. Humans did not first solve survival and then become meaningful. They became meaningful because survival itself, in a human life, was never only a private struggle of the body. It was a shared, remembered, taught, and repeated way of being alive. And if there was no single moment, then perhaps the better answer is this. Humans began to care about more than survival whenever survival demanded that they protect something beyond the next breath. When we bring all the traces together, the answer becomes less like a date and more like a widening circle. At the center was the living body, needing food, warmth, water, rest, and safety. Without these, nothing else could continue. But around that body gathered other needs that were also real, even if they were quieter. The child needed years of protection before becoming strong. The injured person needed time before healing. The elder needed patience from others, but also carried memories the young did not yet have. The dead could no longer help the group, but they remained in memory and changed the meaning of place. A mark on stone, a color on skin, a shell carried close to the body, or a story repeated near a fire did not remove hunger, but each one helped humans hold identity, attention, warning, belonging, or loss. These things were not separate islands. They were connected. A child learned through story. An elder carried stories. A place became meaningful because stories, deaths, shelters, and returns gathered there. A sign mattered because others could recognize it. A weak person mattered because the group had already learned to live through dependence. Each part touched the others. Survival became care when the body of one person could no longer be understood, apart from the bodies, memories, and futures of others. It became memory when the group refused, or simply failed, to let every lesson vanish after one life. It became place when the land held what had happened before. It became story when experience traveled farther than the event itself. It became meaning when people acted as if some things mattered even when they did not feed the stomach immediately. This does not mean every early human life was gentle, symbolic, or full of reflection. Scarcity could be harsh. Fear could narrow the mind. Groups could abandon, fight, forget, or fail. We should not turn prehistory into a peaceful dream. The more honest picture is more human than that. People likely lived between pressure and tenderness, between practical necessity and attachment, between hunger and memory, between movement and return. They did not need to be perfect for care to exist. They did not need to be safe for meaning to begin. In fact, the difficulty of life may be part of why these deeper forms mattered. A world of danger made memory valuable. A world of hunger made sharing meaningful. A world of long childhood made patience necessary. A world of death made absence impossible to ignore. A world without writing made voice, gesture, sign, and remembered place essential. So the question is not whether humans one day stopped caring about survival and started caring about something higher. That would be the wrong shape of the story. Humans never left survival behind. They expanded it. They carried it into relationships, into children, into elders, into grief, into marks, into places, into stories, and into responsibilities that reached beyond the immediate day. A meal kept one body alive. Teaching helped many future meals happen. A fire warmed one night. Remembering how to keep fire alive carried warmth into other nights. A shelter protected the group from weather. Returning to that shelter made it part of the group's memory. A warning saved one person. Repeating the warning gave the past a voice in the future. Slowly, survival became a human world. It became not only the act of staying alive, but the act of keeping life connected, understandable, and worth carrying forward. That may be the deepest answer we can give without pretending to know more than the evidence allows. Humans began to care about more than survival, not when survival ended, but when survival became shared enough, remembered enough, and fragile enough that protecting life meant protecting more than breath. So if we return to the first question, we may have to answer it gently, without forcing the deep past into a sharper shape than it can honestly hold. When did humans begin to care about more than survival? Not after hunger disappeared, not after danger ended, not after life became easy enough for meaning to be invented as a luxury. The traces suggest something quieter and more truthful. Humans began to care about more than survival while they were still hungry, still cold, still moving, still losing people, still learning how to keep children alive, still depending on memory that could vanish with a single death. Meaning did not arrive as a separate world above daily life. It grew from the daily life itself. It grew when someone's weakness required patience. It grew when a child's future mattered before that child could repay the group. It grew when an older person's memory became more valuable than speed. It grew when a dead person remained present in absence. It grew when a place was remembered, when a mark held attention, when a story carried a lesson farther than the body that first learnt it. These beginnings were probably uneven, repeated, forgotten, rediscovered, and changed across many groups and many generations. Some were practical before they were symbolic. Some may have been emotional before they were explained. Some may have had meanings we cannot recover and should not pretend to know, but together they show a pattern that is deeply human. Survival became more than the body continuing. It became the protection of relationships, memory, learning, belonging, and time. This is the educational value of looking carefully at the question. It reminds us that human meaning did not begin by escaping the real needs of the body. It began by taking those needs seriously enough to share them. Food mattered, so sharing mattered. Children were vulnerable, so patience mattered. Knowledge could be lost, so teaching mattered. Death came, so memory mattered. Places sheltered people, so return mattered. Experience could disappear, so story mattered. The things we sometimes call higher human concerns may not be separate from survival at all. They may be survival made wider, slower, and more conscious of others. This does not make early humans perfect, peaceful, or morally simple. It makes them recognizable. They lived under pressure, as humans still do in different ways. They had to choose what to carry, whom to follow, when to move, when to wait, what to remember, and what to let go. In those choices, the first roots of meaning may have formed, not as a finished belief, not as a single invention, not as one clear moment when the human mind crossed a line. More likely meaning gathered the way ash gathers around a long-used fire, slowly, almost invisibly, from repeated acts of living together. A hand feeding a child, a voice warning the young, a group pausing for the weak, a body placed with care. A colour carried across distance, a path returned to because someone remembered, a story told again, so the past would not disappear. These were not small things, even if they were ordinary. They show that the human mind began to hold life in a wider frame than immediate hunger. To be human was not only to survive the day, it was to carry yesterday into tomorrow, to let another life matter to one's own and to leave traces for those who would come after. And perhaps that is why this question cannot end with a final date or a closed answer. The beginning was not a point. It was a deepening. Somewhere in the long darkness before writing, before cities, before formal histories, humans learned that staying alive was not enough if everything learned, loved, remembered, and shared disappeared with each breath. So the question remains open. as it should. When survival itself began to hold memory, care, place, story, and belonging, was it still only survival? Or had humanity already begun?